This November, when we go to the polls, no, in this election and every election, it's about who will have the power to shape our children for the next 4 or 8 years of their lives.
Welcome everyone to Manny's Live. Thank you so much for tuning in to our second ever episode. My name is Manny Yakutiel and I'm the owner of Manny's here on the corner of 16th and Valencia. This is our show where we bring to you leaders in the civic world, politics, social justice, news, and the arts. And tonight we are going to be discussing how to redirect funds from the San Francisco Police Department into the community, the process by which we do this, what people's thinking are around this whole process. And tonight we have two leaders in that exact process and movement here to talk to us about it. Before we get to that, I just want to acknowledge that the land we're on, which is Ohlone land, and so it's important to speak that out. And secondly, words are important, and so I want to say at the front end of this conversation that Black Lives Matter and Black Trans Lives Matter. We also want to acknowledge that there is a protest and rally going on immediately after this, starting in the Compton's cafeteria and going to the Hall of Justice. So after Manny's, feel free to go up to that. And let's tell you a little bit more about what tonight's conversation is going to be about.
The movement to defund the police has risen to the tip of national conversation. To some, it is a call to substantially reduce or completely remove funding of the police force. To others, it is a call to move certain funds and responsibilities away from the police and into community-based organizations in the Black community. Mayor Breed and Supervisor Walton announced plans to do just that on June 4th, but many questions remain. How do you actually engage in the process of redirecting funds from the police? Where should the funds go? What does the interplay look like between the police, the city, the community-serving organizations, and the people themselves? How involved can and will the public be in this process?
All right, friends, thank you for watching that. And now it is my honor to introduce our two incredible guests tonight. We have the Supervisor of District 10, Shaman Walton, and we have the Executive Director of the Human Rights Commission, Cheryl Evans Davis. Welcome, both of you, to Manny's.
Thank you so much for
How
having
you
me.
doing? How are you guys feeling tonight?
Good.
Yeah?
Good. Thank you for the invitation and the ability to kind of sit down and chit-chat a little bit.
Of course, of course. So I wanted to first, before we get into kind of the theory and the process and the big questions, I want to ground this in the personal and in the human and the emotional. So let's start with you, Supervisor Walton. It may seem kind of self-explanatory to a lot of people, but tell folks, if you don't mind, kind of what you do, what area of the city you represent, and why you're so involved in this movement or this, I don't know what we would call it, this effort to redirect funds from the San Francisco Police Department.
Thank you so much, Manny, and thanks for having us tonight. The first thing is I represent District 10 here in San Francisco, so it's the southeast part of the city. Bayview, Hunters Point, Potrero Hill, Visitation Valley, Dog Patch, Little Hollywood. A lot of isolated and disenfranchised communities. We have the largest Black population here in San Francisco at this point, and so making sure that we fight for equity and making sure that we improve the lives and are really impactful in terms of policies that affect the success of our community is important to me. In terms of our conversation right now, there have been hundreds of years where we've been really on the list of exterminating Black men and Black people. And now law enforcement has been getting away with killing unarmed Black men, getting away with killing Black people for so many years without consequences. And if we just look at the fact that we have somebody who can put their knee on someone's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and do it in a manner where they were being facetious and really kind of taunting the crowd and just looking at that man's life as it was meaningless. The time has already come, but we are now at a pivotal time and a pivotal point where change has to happen right now.
I hadn't watched the video until yesterday, actually. It was just something that I was delaying until the absolute last moment. I mean, I went to the protests, but it's just such a hard video to watch, obviously, the brute violence of it all, and it's still sticking with me, obviously. And we're going to get into that a lot more in a bit. But first, Cheryl, can I call you Cheryl?
Please,
Can I call you? I don't know. Can I call you Shimon? Okay, great.
Definitely.
Just for the purposes of this conversation. So you run the Human Rights Commission. Can you tell folks a little bit about what that actually means and what that commission, what the body does, and why is the Human Rights Commission involved in this conversation around redirecting funds from the police department?
Yeah, so you know, it's an interesting, I was a school teacher for a long time, so a lot of time, like, it's not that I started out with, like, I want to be the director of the Human Rights Commission, but the mission and the purpose of the commission are really very special to me. It was created to address disparities and discrimination and bias, and to have a body where folks could file those complaints and they'd be responded to. And in all honesty, it was actually born out of civil rights movements and the inability of black people to buy from the Cadillac dealership here in San Francisco.
Wow.
And that the mayor at the time said, look, I don't want what's happening in LA and what's happening in other places to happen here. So they started it kind of as a task force that grew into what is now the commission. I'm very fortunate that I had the ability to work with Supervisor Walton before he was supervisor, back when he was Shaman all the time, and Mayor Breed, right, in community. And I just have been really grateful that I know for the two of them, regardless of politics and everything else aside, that when they ask me to do something or if they want to partner with me, it's really rooted in no bureaucracy, no politics, but like, how do we actually get to community voice? How do we actually prioritize and center community as subject matter experts? And so I've just been grateful for their leadership, because I know that they actually went into politics for the sole purpose of changing outcomes for people that they work with. So I think I am pulled into this in some ways because the supervisor and the mayor want community to be the center of this.
Incredible.
And I'm fortunate to actually be able to help lead that process.
I'm laughing at, and I just have to say this because I apologize to Director Davis a lot, because we put a lot of stuff on our plate around equity. And every time we come up with a new idea or something new to get community involved so we can address the needs and concerns of community, we throw it in the Human Rights Commission.
And they always say it's the last time.
Right. So,
but it's good. It's the three of you together. It's a powerful triumvirate to address this issue. So I'm going to ask the two of you to tell each other a story, if you don't mind. And I think it's important because this is all about the police. And I think how we feel about the police oftentimes is grounded on our own personal experiences with them. So do you mind telling each other a story of an interaction that you each had with a member of the police force that has kind of created or impacted your view of them? I asked Chief Scott about the same question last night. So what's an interaction you had with the police that really colored your view of the police force?
and who do you want to start?
Oh, maybe you can ask Director Davis.
So what was your experience like that you want to describe with law enforcement?
I don't know. I think my experience is going to be very different than yours and than most folks. So I'm originally from Texas. I was born in the South, but I grew up in the Bay Area. And so all of my memories of going to visit the South are kind of peppered with fear of engaging the police or breaking some unwritten rule around Jim Crow or other things. My grandmother was, she went, her father was a sharecropper, her grandfather was a slave. So like those experiences for me were embedded pretty early. And so I never ever wanted to encounter the police. And so now today, like if I see the police driving behind me, I'm gonna like slow down, I'm gonna be afraid.
Even though you're a city leader?
Oh my gosh, I had this conversation at a police commission meeting because I was like, I got pulled over on 19th Street, but I was with a friend who was driving a Cadillac, and I was like, oh my God, we're like black people in a Cadillac. Like somebody's gonna think we're doing something dirty. And so I like immediately went into arguing with them, and my friend said, stop it, because like I'm the one that's gonna be like attacked or that's gonna get in trouble as the black man. But we both had emotions. Mine were kind of like, why are you pulling us over? And his were like, shut up and be quiet. Like,
I mean, for me, my earliest memories are seeing people get arrested in community, seeing family get arrested. But as I became a teenager, we started driving. We would be in cars. There would be a lot of us in cars. We didn't have a lot of money. If one person had a car, everybody piled in. And that always brought a lot of attention from law enforcement,
Yeah.
whether regardless of if you were doing something wrong or not. And I just remember being pulled over several times for nothing. And at some points, guns would be drawn. I mean, I talked a little bit about this when we did something here with the district attorney not too long ago. But being pulled over just because we were black people in a car and it was a certain number of us. And you know, that's a feeling that never leaves you. I'm 45 years old. I'm a member of the Board of Supervisors. And
You look great.
just like Cheryl said, thank you. And just like Cheryl said, you know, when a police officer gets behind me, you know, it's an eerie feeling, especially when I'm outside of the Bay Area and when I'm outside of San Francisco.
When they don't know
Yeah, it's, you know,
who you are.
It's,
Or you don't know who to call.
And I mean, you've had experiences of racism even as Supervisor Walton in
yeah,
the city.
right here in San Francisco.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so, you know, it's sad. It's very disheartening that we continue to have to deal with racism in the way we do.
Yeah.
For me, I really just feel bad and hurt more so for young people and people who, you know, you try to teach them values. You try to teach them that if you live a certain way and you do certain things, you'll be okay. But in reality, that's not the case.
Okay, so let's get into it a little bit because I feel like a lot of people are talking about defunding the police. It's on everyone's mind. I was on Haim's Instagram, which is probably the whitest thing I've ever done today. And even Haim, this folk band, was, you know, defund the police. It's on everyone's mind. Everyone's talking about it. But, you know, you two are getting into the nitty gritty. And so my question to you is kind of, when you think about this, what would you say is the overall goal? Like, what are you trying to accomplish in this process?
I mean, I would love to hear, because we have had like big conversations, but not deep with the supervisor. But I think there are a couple of things for me off top, is that for me, this process is about how to allocate the funds that will be earmarked, and to hear from community. But the other thing that, as we get into all of these conversations, is that, again, growing up in the South, but also being raised by a lot of older black folks from the South, like typically older black folks are very conservative, right? And so if you go to some of these communities where they're gonna be like, what do you mean defund the police? Who am I gonna call when, you know, somebody's doing something? So I think that there's a real balance and a real conversation that has to be had about like, what, if we're going to totally defund the police, what does that look like in terms of who's saving us?
Is that actually on the table, a total defunding of the police?
I mean, I think that that's the call right now. I don't think that that's necessarily on the table in San Francisco, but as we think about this, as we roll this out, like there are definitely people that are reaching out to the supervisor, to me, that are saying all the money should be used somewhere else.
Right, okay, so some people are saying take all the money away, give it to somewhere else. So when you're at the center of this, so what are you thinking as kind of an overall goal of this whole process?
Well, one, I want to acknowledge what Cheryl said in terms of how some of the seniors in community feel. We went through this with the closure of Juvenile Hall. In terms of, a lot of times it becomes a conversation of folks just understanding what they know and also not really listening to what you're trying to accomplish and what the goals are. The main thing for me would be, big picture, is to end racism. And you know, more importantly, I want our black children, our Latino children, our children of color, our Pacific Islander children, to be able to walk down the street, go to the grocery store, you know, get pulled over by law enforcement and feel like they are going to be safe and they're going to be okay, and not have to fear anyone for whatever job they do. And that's not the case here. And so it's definitely about taking resources from the police department, from a system of oppression, from a system, in a lot of cases, that has really demonstrated that their goal is to get rid of some of our folks of color.
Got it.
And so, yeah, and if it comes to a point where we can have peace officers in our community, or get to a point where we can keep people safe, and it's not a police response, that's what we want.
Got it. So let's get into the meat and potatoes about this. The budget of the police is $660 million. It's a lot of money, more money than I'll ever see in my life. And we don't have to go into everything of the budget, but I know that Tony Montoya, who runs the police union, sent a letter out to the police officers, and one of the things he said was basically, don't worry about your pay, because your pay is not changing at all. Now I have to imagine a large percentage of the $660 million is pay, and so he mentioned that there's a closed contract, and obviously with the budget deficit, the only way that, you know, that pay gets renegotiated is if the union and the union members are willing to renegotiate it. So how do you take away money from the budget if the pay doesn't change at all?
So first of all, I would say that the proposed budget for fiscal year 2021 is actually more like $736 million.
$736 million?
Yes. So,
wow.
So, you know, just to put it in context, you know, we're very close to $1 billion budget for the San Francisco Police Department.
Wow.
But there are areas that you can look at and be thoughtful about how you redirect resources.
And they have like
and move them.
122 open positions right now.
So what does that mean, open position? That means that money is in the budget even if it's not being used
Correct.
to...
Correct.
Okay.
So I think
and
they
you can't take
proposed
that
that
money.
as, I think the police department last week proposed that as some of their cost savings.
Yeah, well, because
Right.
the mayor asked for 10 to 15% budget reductions
Cuts.
from all city departments.
Right.
At the maximum level, that's about 105 million plus for the police department. So we're talking about 105 million that's already been on the table for reduction. We still have to get resources to reinvest into community. Obviously, some of that can come from there, but we're talking about a pretty big number to really show that we're about reparations. We're really about an investment in the black community.
So what does that look like to you? If $105 million is what the mayor's asking of everyone, basically, what does it look like to actually, like you said, show that you're walking the walk, not just talking the talk, and you've also been leading on reparations? Is that like half the budget, $350 million, more than half?
Until I really comb through the budget and dive in, which I've been definitely, of course, looking at areas where we can pool resources, but I want to be very thoughtful about talking about where we're going to redirect resources, because it's very important. We take this serious. We are talking about large numbers, so
Yeah.
I do not want to jump the gun. And the main thing, and going back to Director Davis's point, this is a community process. You know,
Yeah.
community has to be involved every step of the way and actually be leading on what they want to see, what types of decisions we can make. There are conversations about percentages, there are conversations about actual dollar figure, but we really want to make sure that community input is involved before we start saying what direction we're going to go in.
Got it. I want to know more about community input kind of a little bit later, but another thing that was mentioned in Mr. Montoya's letter was he said, no more doing more with less. And I think this is one of the big questions on people's mind, which is if you're going to take funding away from the police, is the expectation that the police actually does less in community. So is that what you're thinking?
I mean, the mayor said that, right?
Yeah.
I'm excited about police officers not showing up to harass people. I'm excited about trying to come up with a way where we can get, do things on, like when, Mr. Montoya said that police are not going to respond to SFMTA requests anymore on our bus lines.
Right.
We don't want police response for everything anyway.
Right.
So thank you, Mr. Montoya. I appreciate that. But here's the reality. There are things that we have typically had a police response for, whether it's addressing issues of our folks experiencing homelessness, whether it's coming out to some of our schools to respond to things that are happening with our young people. We don't need a police response for everything. You see, and this is not my mantra, but the barbecue Beckys and the folks of the world that are arbitrarily calling police officers on people and even making bold statements as, I'm going to call them and tell them that you're a black man and you're harassing me. That's a threat. And that
Tell them
has
about
led,
your new legislation.
and that has led to death.
Yeah.
That's why we are going to write legislation that says if you arbitrarily call the police, if you are someone who is calling police because you are racist, because you're discriminatory, because you're prejudiced, and the police come out, you're going to actually have to pay a fine. And we're looking into if we can even do things to charge folks criminally for that. That has literally led to the death of people.
Yeah.
Particularly black people and people of color.
Yeah. So I've heard responses to folks experiencing homelessness. I've heard arbitrary calls that seem or are racially motivated. I've heard things that are not life-threatening issues, SFMTA. So there's the idea that the police are called when it's really something extraordinary is happening or criminal. I mean, I think a lot of people, myself included, I love this idea. I think it's great, and I think, you know, in conversations that I've had with officers around here, I don't think you get a lot of opposition from officers to not have to respond to a lot of these calls. I think that a lot of them don't want to do it.
Right.
And there's the idea to quickly supplant those calls with counselors and social workers and behavioral
And community,
specialists.
I mean, like, this is the piece around the challenge around, like, who's community, who's not, and how do we define that? But
Right.
if I know the person that is kind of like wiling out right now, then I can just be like, hey, knock it off, or like, I'm gonna call your neighbor, or your caseworker. Like, understanding where we're from,
Yeah.
right, or which block we're from makes a huge difference from seeing somebody, seeing what we describe as peculiar behavior, and then trying to make a decision about who they are.
Yeah, which so often is what premeditates these calls, is someone who doesn't know someone saying, I see something strange, and
Yeah.
bad things happen. Before we move on, I do kind of want to talk about pay and people's pay, because it's a touchy subject, but we're in the middle. We have a $2 billion hole in our budget, practically, 1.7 over the next year, and we need to close this hole. And something that's come up a lot with folks, and I'm going to direct you guys to the screen, is just people's pay in our city. And we did some research here in the team, and just to name a couple of numbers, the police chief makes $342,000 a year with benefits. Sheriff's captain makes $184,000. The average pay of a police officer is $104,000 plus benefits. The mayor makes $350,000. Board of supervisors $140,000. It's a lot of money, and I think a lot of people in San Francisco are hurting. And so I guess the question is, do you think everyone should be taking a pay cut right now, 10, 15%, including people that work for the city?
Well, we're definitely having conversations about that in terms of where resources should come from. Obviously, we still have to look at the entire budget to say what reductions are actually going to be reality and what's going to happen. But yeah, those conversations are on the table. I definitely think as you look at the wealth gap that exists in San Francisco, that's why we have a CEO tax that we're pushing to where, you know, we have CEOs that are making $17, $18 million more than their average employee.
Right.
I mean, those things have to change. We're not going to have equitable wages and opportunity here in San Francisco if that doesn't happen. But that's at the table. But I don't want to say every city employee needs to take a wage hit or a wage cut, because we have a lot of city employees that are just barely making it. They don't make enough. I mean, my fight is always for everyone to get more wages and to be able to earn a better living.
Because I think that to close the gap shouldn't be about how do we give some people less, it should be how do we give some people more. And I think that part of the challenge here is, like, we could definitely give folks pay cuts, but what are we going to do about the cost of living? Because most people, in order to live in San Francisco, are probably spending 50%, if not more, of their salary. And then if they have kids, then they're paying for childcare or this thing, or even transportation. So I think that there's all these things that have to be addressed to that as well.
I think it just gets hard because we've interviewed so many folks in city government here. And the question on a lot of San Franciscans' mind is, we have this $12 billion budget. We have one of the wealthiest tax bases in the country, and yet, and then you can fill in the blank with the issues that affect our city.
It's all about priorities, though, Manny.
Yeah.
You know, you can have all the money in the world, but if you're not prioritizing where you have the most need, then that's going to continue to be problematic. The wealth gap is going to continue to grow. That's why we're fighting so hard to invest in the black community. That's why we're fighting so hard to invest in communities of color and make sure that young people that haven't typically had an opportunity to be exposed to the things that lead you to success, we actually do something about that to change that. And it's going to take a large investment. It's going to stop focusing on incarcerating our young people and focusing on spending money on their education. It's going to stop focusing on mass incarceration and spending over $60,000, $70,000 a year to incarcerate somebody, and do that front end investment. And let's really do some things about intervention. So that's the issue, is what we're prioritizing. And this is really an opportunity for us, when we talked about redirecting resources from the police department, to demonstrate where our priorities are and why we're so focused on the investment. If you do not put resources in the areas of the most need, you're going to continue to perpetuate and feed isolation, disenfranchisement, and the wealth gap continues to grow. people continue to be more frustrated,
Right.
and people act out in certain ways.
And
we
that
can do better.
investment, I think, has to be, like we've been talking about this a lot around outreach and engagement, and as we
Yeah.
start to try and put money into the community, right? Like if I'm doing the same job as you, but as a city employee, you get 200,000, and as a community worker, I get 40,000.
Right.
Like that is a problem,
Right.
right? And so how are we balancing that? And I think the other piece around this that folks really, when we talk about equity, that gets really difficult is sometimes we need to be sending fewer resources to certain neighborhoods, right? And so what does it look like to say we're going to spend more money in the Tenderloin, or we're going to spend more money in Bayview, and maybe we're going to have a little bit, maybe street sweeping is, once a week here, and over here it's 4 times a week, and somebody has to, those are the
Because
hard
there's
discussions.
less trash, because there's less issues, because there's less problem. This whole, there used to be everybody gets the same thing, and then we're doing a great job as a city, or we're doing a great job as
Right.
people.
Right.
That is total BS.
Right.
Right? Certain areas require more attention, they require a higher level of resources. That's what we got to focus on.
Right.
And I tell all of our allies, and I have to say this every conversation we have as a result of what has happened with George Floyd, and many examples even prior and still since George Floyd's killing at the hands of law enforcement. If you're really serious about being allies and supporting what we need to do to change the negative impacts for Black people, then you need to support the policies that we're fighting for and the things that we're fighting for. That means we're going to put resources into the Black community, invest there. That means some things that you've been typically used to are going to have to change.
Right.
And
In other parts of the city,
it-
or
that-
other
that-
programs and
that-
services.
There's always some kind of trade-off
Yeah.
when you want to provide
Yeah.
opportunity. But do we need to do things and promote more opportunities in areas where people are living a certain way and they have certain advantages already?
Right.
We need to take those resources and focus on helping people grow and climb so we can get to some level of equity, which already takes a lot of time.
One of the most charming things about San Francisco is it's a city of micro communities. You can go
Yeah.
4 blocks in one direction, you're in a totally different zone. Frankly, you go to a different part of Dolores Park, you're in a different community. You find yourself on the gay beach, you're going to have a different experience than on the Bro Flats. What that also means is there's a lot of silos, and so I would bet that the people in the marina probably don't know what's going on in the Bayview and in the shipyard and Hunters Point. And so sometimes you get this myopia and this this people are isolated and cut off and probably don't feel like they understand what's going on in other parts of the city.
Well, I said earlier, I was a teacher, so I used to teach on in Pacific Heights. So I worked in Broadway and Fillmore, and I lived on Turk and Fillmore.
Okay.
And so walking from
Yeah.
Broadway and Fillmore going home and literally seeing like the street cleaning change or the way like that for me is actually how I got into community work, is like I know what I'm doing in this private school.
Yeah.
And then the community center around the corner, actually the cultural center where the mayor was working at that time, like they had fewer resources, fewer opportunities. I was teaching kindergarten boys who were working on a computer. I was volunteering with 11th grade students who had never turned on a computer.
Wow.
And so like that piece for me is huge in terms of just like not even knowing. And I remember taking kids, the school was great. We opened the doors up. They did this summer camp. We took the kids up there, and I remember the first time I parked on Broadway, I parked on Fillmore between Broadway and Vallejo, and we get out the car, and these kids from Fillmore were like, this is a hill, this is crazy. Like they were terrified.
Wow.
They had literally never been like on the other side of Geary Street.
Wow.
So they were like, what, I could never seen a hill like this. I was like, you live 5 blocks away.
It's actually such an interesting time to be talking about rethinking of the deployment of funds, because we have this, let's just call it a $2 billion hole that needs to be filled, $1.7 billion. We're in an economic free fall for the most part. A lot of the small businesses in the city are facing extinction or very grave profit and loss statements. You have a civil rights movement and unrest that is calling for a complete rethinking of how a major agency is funded and where that money goes. And also, you're going to have union contracts be pressured to be renegotiated all throughout the city. Your salary, the salary of, people in City Hall, police officers, SFMTA. I mean, I imagine in order to close that budget gap, it's a big one. Those conversations, like you said, are going to need to happen. And so, how are you thinking? Let's get right into it. When you talk about investing in the Black community, what does that actually look like in dollars and cents? Like, where do you, this pot of money is given. How do you deploy those funds? Do you follow existing mechanisms and just put more money in those kind of mechanisms, or how are you guys thinking about this?
And Supervisor, can you just be clear that investing in the Black community is not only the Bayview? So as you talk about that, because I think
most
people
definitely.
think, oh, you're only going to give money to the Bayview. Like, Black people they're not a lot, but they are throughout the city.
And you know, Director Davis and I have already been working on reparations here in San Francisco, and we have been having community conversations across the city with Black leadership, with members of the Black community, and asking them, what areas of injustice do you want to see an investment in? Education, unemployment, overcriminalization, outmigration, housing, you know, health disparities. So there are things that the community is identifying. We've already had a lot of conversations. We're going to continue. Obviously, we're in a budget process, so we need to convene community so they can have input and make sure that we get resources out to community. I know everybody wants to talk about a number or a percentage.
Right.
You're not going to get that from me in this conversation.
Are you sure?
Because we're not.
Because it's hot in here. I think, you know, we can keep going for a while.
Because we're not there yet. But I do want to be clear. This is about making sure that Black people in San Francisco receive actual reparations, and there's an investment that's going to be long term. It has to be systemic investment. It has to be something that is going to change outcomes for Black people. So I can tell you the focus is really going to be on doing something deep. It's not going to be something that's just about scratching the surface. Let me do something one time for people over here or one time for people over here. It's going to be about the entire Black community, and it's going to be about the Black community.
Yeah. Can we talk about reparations for a second? Because when you and I talked about doing this, you mentioned it to me and you told me it was something that you're working on, both of you are working on, you're very passionate about. So what does that mean to you, reparations, and what's some of the work that you're doing to enact that, and what would you see as the overall goal of, you know, what does success look like?
Well, reparations, quite frankly and quite simply, is pay what you owe. You know, you have 400 years of free labor in this country. This country was built on the backs and the labor of my ancestors, and so many people got wealthy, and so you got to pay what you owe. And we also look at some of the things that have happened here in San Francisco, whether it's redlining, the outmigration, overcriminalization, over-incarceration. And you look at every bad dynamic, every bad statistic, you can see Black people at the top in San Francisco.
Right.
So reparations
You
is
said, I remember in your interview with
that.
Heather Knight, that even though the Black community represents, I think, 3% of San Francisco, no, the unemployment rate is 3%. The African American community has a 15% unemployment rate, which you mentioned 2 nights ago, I think.
And you know, and I would of course add, it's probably much exacerbated during COVID-19, as we know. And so, paying what you owe and giving back and putting community on equitable footing. You know, what slavery did to us in this country, what segregation did to us in this country, it kept us from getting a wealth opportunity. And so you'll never, ever get true equity without being able to build wealth. So my children, my grandchildren have an opportunity to be successful and build the kind of wealth that is generational. And that has to happen with the reparations plan that we come up with.
I mean, I would add to that this idea of reparations and the harm that was caused, like to think about it in the sense of literally repairing the damage that was done. And I think that there's some pieces of it that it's almost impossible to quantify in a dollar amount. So when I was talking earlier about the conservative nature of like the older generation, like reparations needs to address that, because when I say conservative, I mean in the sense that the fear of your children going out and being, you know, lynched or being beat or being taken away from you made people be much more harder and tighter around, like, when you go outside. Like I have heard in my lifetime people say, I'm going to get you because it's better I get you than the police.
That's right.
Right, like that is something that I remember hearing as a young child. Like people, you know, like we talk about it, I laugh and joke sometimes with my mom and say, statute of limitations has run out. Can I tell people that you used to like hit me? Right? Like there are people literally are like, it's better for me to whoop my child than for them to go out and talk to somebody in the wrong manner.
That was
or
my household all day.
Right?
Yeah.
Wow.
So like when I
Definitely.
talk about conservative, it's like the system of how people were treated forced them to like really react and raise their children in a way that I'd rather you be hurt a little bit right now than dead later.
And all of us in California, our roots come from the South. My grandmother is from Odessa, Louisiana. Her and her sisters migrated to San Francisco. My mom and my uncles and my aunties got the experience at least going down there to the South. So we're always 1 degree of separation away from slavery, from segregation. And that's why our parents and grandparents raised us in that way, because they wanted us to be safe.
Right. And of course, this week there was a lynching. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not even something that you can think of in your grandparents and your auntie's time. I mean, this is happening right now in this country. It is the present also, which makes it even more important. You and I met before you actually, I think, probably announced your run, or you had just started running, and now you're, I'm not going to say you're a City Hall insider, but you're certainly in City Hall. Do you
Disruptor. He's a City Hall disruptor.
I mean, you come out with a lot of amazing things. You're in the chair now, and now you see how the sausage is made. One of my most favorite expressions. How do you think this is actually possible? Like it'll actually happen now that you see how everything happens or doesn't happen? Do you think there's a chance this might happen in San Francisco and we can lead?
Yeah, I mean, I don't do anything. I think Director Davis will tell you this with the thought process of you can't. In fact, I have a problem when you talk about folks making those $300,000 salaries, $200,000 salaries, and you get in front of the Board of Supervisors and talk about what you can't do. That's a problem.
When someone who's making that much and then they say, I can't do this?
Yeah, I don't. So can't is something that it's really a part of somebody else's vocabulary. I really think we can do things,
Where do you think that
we have
comes
to find
from?
out. Being a black man, if I thought I couldn't do anything, then I wouldn't be in the place and space where I am. We wouldn't be having this conversation right now. We're always told what we can't do, and being able to have some level of success, being able to fight through things and have some resiliency. I know that everything can happen. You just got to work through it, work through the sausage, and figure out how to get it done.
Because I'm sure you were told too, you have to work twice as hard to get half as much.
And we do. I mean, it's real lit. Like even through this COVID, I was just talking with Director Davis when we came in here. I've been going to City Hall 3-4 days a week. Because as a black man, if I go into City Hall, I'm not taking it serious.
Right.
If I don't, then I'm not working hard enough, right? And this is how we live, and this is what I tell our young black children. You have to be there early. You have to do things to make yourself be visible and
When
stand
you're on
out
time, you're
in
late.
a positive light. All those things are reality because we walk in a room at a deficit, and it's unfortunate, and it still happens to this day, even in our roles.
Yeah. So I just have a couple more questions, and then we're going to get to the break room, which get excited for that. It's really fun, and it'll be your opportunity to engage with each other about this conversation. So stay tuned for the break room. I just have a couple more questions for you guys. And like I said, I support this idea. I think it's a great idea, and I'm really excited that the city's taking leadership on it. You're hearing the movement of 8 Can't Wait, also in the same breath as defund the police. And a lot of people are saying in order to fix the problems we're seeing in the police force, we need to have more implicit bias training. We need to have more thorough background checks for anyone that's hired. We need to have a much longer training period. It should take a lot longer than 21 weeks to become a police officer. It should take 2-3 years. You need to have your own degree. A lot of people are saying we need to fund more body cameras, better body cameras everywhere. To me, that sounds like a lot more money in the police department to make it better. So how do you square the circle between do less, have less, and be better, and it'll cost more to do it?
Well, one, I don't think the mantra should be do less, have less, right? You do things efficiently and for the right reasons in the right way. So for example, I was talking to an officer who is not from San Francisco, and he said in his training he was taught to treat Bayview a certain way, treat Sunnydale a certain way, treat the Western Addition a certain way, treat Lakeview a certain way. So he had a biased thought process about those communities here in San Francisco without ever spending time in there. That's the kind of training he got. So you don't have to pay more money to have more common sense training that your job is to treat people right as an officer.
Right.
Your job as a civil servant is to make sure that people are okay and not to harm people. That doesn't take more money. And we need to focus on that part of work. There's also other things that we do to keep communities safe. You know, we have community ambassadors. We have folks that look out for community. I mean, if you look at crime data in San Francisco, particularly violent crime, it has gone down over the years.
Yeah.
It's not because we have a whole bunch of police officers on the street. There's so many other things that have led to that, including communities working together and doing things differently. So it's not about having less. It is about doing things efficiently. It is about those trainings, implicit bias, which we got to go deeper than implicit bias. We got to talk about racism.
Right.
Like, let's be clear. Implicit bias, yeah, okay.
Right.
But most of these folks have a real bias. They know about their bias.
I asked the police chief that question 2 nights ago. He was sitting in your chair.
I'm not buying the implicit bias thing. I mean, I do know it exists because there are people who are raised in a bubble that don't see things, you know, but not in San Francisco.
Do you
not
feel
when you
like
spend time here. You ain't implicit. Your bias is very explicit.
Right.
You know what you're doing. You know what you're about. Just like when you said, I'm sorry, I have to say this.
Please.
Like you said, people who live in certain areas of San Francisco may not know what's happening. We are a very learned community here in San Francisco. Folks know what's happening in Bayview. Folks know what's happening in Fillmore. Folks know what's happening in Tenderloin in San Francisco. Because they can send me emails about it all day and they don't live there, but at the moment they step foot in there for 1 second, all of a sudden they want to judge it and don't want to do anything to help. Let's change
Or even
the
know
dynamic.
that it's San Francisco. I mean, to that point, like they may know and they think about those neighborhoods. I mean, I had somebody tell me when they went to Sunnydale with someone who was like, "Are we still in San Francisco?"
They said that?
Yeah. Like, what is this? Like, oh my gosh, people live like this? And I was like, what? Like, really? Like, that is so, like, not okay. But I think that there's a level of, as we do this work, like, I think it does go back to, we talk about these care ambassadors or community ambassadors, like, rooting and grounding that. I know James Spangola is doing that in the Western Addition. You got folks that are doing it in the Bayview, you know, like YCD, Young Community Developers, and DJ, and folks are saying, look, we're going to empower the folks that have the relationships that are in community. Like, let's compensate folks for their time. Like, stop using their wisdom, their knowledge, their relationships to improve outcomes and then don't recognize them. So I think that part of this is like, how are we taking this money, first and foremost, to actually hear from community? Not from me, you know, like I always say, like, I can say what I want to say, but this is what gets me upset is when people are like, you only care about black people. And I'm like, so we're going to do this project? It's not going to benefit me, right? Like, we're going to create more jobs. I actually have a job. Right, and I really try to work, to Supervisor's point, I try to make sure that people know I do my job, so there's no question about whether I earn my keep or not, right? But that there is a sense of, like, the ancestors saying, but you also have to really do your job, right? And so as we are doing this, how are we creating space for everybody to feel visible, to feel respected, and to feel relevant to their communities, and not to do it in a way where we minimize people's existence. So part of this conversation, I always appreciate the supervisor because he's unapologetic, and like I tell people all the time,
and
like,
we love you for it.
Like,
You're
do
amazing.
not try to like get him to change his mind because you don't agree with him. Like, that is just not going to happen.
Right.
He is moved and swayed by community voice, by community input, and by who's going to be, like, equity is about who's bearing the burden and making sure that the person that's bearing the burden has the most say in, like, how we relieve the pressure. And that's this whole process that we're going to do. How do we make sure that if we look at whether it's academic outcomes, whether we look at health disparities, whether we look at economic development, who's worse off? And yet we are always coming up with ideas and strategies over how to improve the outcomes for that population of folks without actually talking to them.
Without talking to them. So what I'm hearing is bring the community in a lot more. It's not necessarily doing less with less, but actually thinking a lot smarter of doing things with what you have, but also cutting a
Now,
fair
it might
amount.
mean less for the police department.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we're
not
doing
less.
it with less. We're reinvesting resources
Yeah.
that exist and putting them in an area where we can get a better benefit and better outcomes.
Right. So my last question is right on that same point, Director, which is how are you thinking about, and probably already, bringing people into the deliberative process who are going to be the most affected, positively, one would hope, by this effort? I mean, how are you bringing those people into that effort and listening to them, and also how much time do you actually have to do that? Because it's budget season right now.
We just talked about this last week. So basically, we've got in the next 2 to 3 weeks to like do a massive community engagement process, right? You know, we are doing some meetings already with folks who identify as Black and want to make sure that those voices are centered in this conversation. We've had over 200 people email the HRC roundtable saying that they want to participate in the conversation. And so given the parameters and the constraints around like how we can meet with folks, we'll have a couple of meetings in the next week. I think June 29th, we're looking to have basically a reparations forum, the supervisor trying to engage with Policy Link, as well as Derek Hamilton, who's been leading a lot of the conversations around reparations and universal basic income. And then after June 29th, we're going to have a series of these meetings. We're going to do much like you are. We're going to have like a Zoom and then go into breakout rooms, and we'll rotate. The groups are going to be based on what we kind of heard initially from reparations around education, around community leadership, and we're going to like fast track that. And then I will take all that with the folks at the HRC, all the information that we have, synthesize it, and get it over to the mayor and the supervisor.
See, she just has a small job.
I love that. I mean, your reputation precedes you. Everyone knows you as someone that does so much, and you go above and beyond, and you have such a heart and soul and a deep passion for the work, and you bring so much to the commission and to the department. So
You have to stop because I'm not good with compliments, so I appreciate that.
Well,
the work speaks for itself.
Yes,
100%.
and it is great work. Well, thank you both so much. I really, really appreciate the time. I know you're in the midst of this process. You're also responding to a great crisis, and I'm sure your constituents have been, your constituents, you have constituents too, of course, are asking a lot of you, and they need you. So thank you for coming to Manny's tonight and for having this conversation with me. So right now what we're going to do actually is we're going to go into the break room. So for those who are watching, the URL is www.tinyurl.com/Manny's break room. That's tinyurl.com/Manny's, oh, like this, right here. Amazing. tinyurl.com/Manny's break room. And you can start going there now, and we're going to have break rooms set up for everyone, and we're going to announce that all. But before we do that, I just want to say San Francisco is blessed with some incredible, incredible public servants and city leaders. We here at Manny's have had the opportunity, and me personally, of getting to know them and meet them. And we're really blessed with incredible, incredible people. And I have to say, to you especially, Shaman, because I've gotten to know you over the years, you're an ideal public servant because you've lived what you're working for, you understand the community that you are fighting for, and you do it with so much pizzazz. And I'm just so glad to know you, and thank you for your work, and I wish you both luck in this process. A lot of people are watching, and I'm sure you'll do it really well. So thank you very much to the Director of the Human Rights Commission of San Francisco, Cheryl Evans-Davis. Thank you so much to the Supervisor of District 10, Shaman Walton. Next up on Manny's Live on Tuesday at 6 p.m., following today's landmark Supreme Court ruling, we are actually going to give the Manny's Live stage to 10 DACA recipients who will, in succession, tell their stories and let you know what this court ruling means to them and how what happened today in our Supreme Court is going to affect their lives. It's going to be an emotional, powerful conversation and discussion and storytelling. So do tune in Tuesday at 6 o'clock. If you're not already at the march and you'd like to join the break room, awesome. But I do want to mention one last time that there is a march happening right now in downtown San Francisco. So show up and or join the Manny's break room. One final time, it's tinyurl.com/Manny's break room. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good night.